Assalamu alaikum, good people on YouTube. I want to share with you some of my reflections as I'm reading the 6th chapter of the Holy Qur'an. Just a few verses that come up, but I also want to connect them to contemporary developments in our world today. And I think it makes for very interesting reflection if you see these verses and you relate them to real life. Now, first of all, let me just put you in the picture here with history. You see, the Prophet ﷺ, if you look at chapter 6, Surah An'am, if you look at that particular chapter, then this chapter is regarded as a Meccan chapter. In other words, the verse, the chapter in its entirety, and it's quite a lengthy chapter. It's 164 or 65 verses. And all of these verses are thought or are regarded as having been revealed in Mecca. So let me just put everyone in the picture. When we say a chapter or a section of the Holy Book was revealed in Mecca to the Prophet Muhammad, then what we mean is that during that 13 years that he constituted a very small, almost insignificant group of 20 or 30 people, that during this period he received certain communications from God in the form of wahi or revelation. And these verses clearly project the context or the reigning feeling of the time. And if you read the verses, and especially now looking at chapter 6, what I notice, and I've gone up to verse 145. I've read the whole chapter, but I'm in detail now committing it to the English language, and I'm at about verse 145. And so in my reading, in my detailed reading, in which I also compare with existing explainers or mufassirin, as well as with existing translations, and also with traditional Arabic dictionaries. So that is how I conduct my reading of the word, of the book. What I notice is that the ethos, the feeling of a man caught in a tough and almost laborious battle with detractors is in evidence, right? So when you read this chapter and you read the verses, you see a tough debate or engagement of the Prophet and his small group with a majority of detractors and opponents, really. And that comes through very, very clearly. But the arguments that the Prophet is presenting, in fact, the arguments which he is given through divine revelation, are extremely powerful and persuasive arguments. So that comes through. Many of these arguments are there. But another thing that comes through in these verses is how much the reality that he faces is similar to the reality that you and me, that we experience today. Now, first of all, let me draw a few parallels between those realities, and then we'll look at one or two verses, and you can see how real these verses feel, how relevant or how relatable these verses sound. So let me give you a few parallels. Well, first of all, the Prophet is dealing with two types of people. On the one hand, he's dealing with what the Qur'an calls mushrikeen, right? And these are people who are, as you can say, sitting on a rudderless boat on the ocean. And they really go the way the wind blows them. They are the most gullible. They are there to act on the whims and fancies of the elite, which brings us to a second parallel, and that is the existence of that elite. And I'm not making this up. I'm going to show you one or two verses where it will show clearly what I'm telling you here. So within that environment where the prophet is trying to wake up his people and trying to get them to realize the problem that they are facing, there is this cultural and religious elites. It's basically the same thing, in fact. But there's an economic elite also. And the economic elite and the cultural elite are sort of in some sort of an alliance. So let's take the cultural elite. Now, the cultural elite must be seen as the same as the religious elite at the time of the Prophet in the year 610, up till about 620, right? So those 10, 12 years there. One must understand that cultural elite to be the same as the religious elite. What does it comprise? What you have is, and I'm referring now to the majority of pagans, you people who are really uncommitted to any solid, permanent law or legal system. So they are basically living at the behest, or in terms of the behest of those who are powerful. And the cultural practices at this time, when the Prophet is addressing his people, consists of a number of practices that are really unfounded. So there would be superstition, there would be certain rituals that these people would perform. They would have regular weekly, daily rituals. And it's not all to do with just bowing down and giving reverence to their, to their effigies or their statues. But there were other things that they would, apportion part of their crop as something that they allocate to their gods. They would every day do certain practices like enter their houses through the back door, and not, there would be a number of these superstitions. Of course, they would have regular visits to the holy places, and there were holy sites everywhere. So they would go to these holy sites, let's say, and normally natural phenomena like a well or a water source in the desert, an oasis, right, would normally be a holy place. So there where there's water, that would be a holy place. Or a mountain would be regarded as a holy place. And so they would associate a deity or a god or some sort of figure to that holy spot, and then there would be regular visits to it, and there would also be donations made to the person in charge of that particular holy spot. So that is pretty much how the practices worked. And then, of course, there was this thing about killing children who are thought to be not viable financially or economically, so they would practice abortion. The only thing is, the abortion they practice was of the newly born, which is the difference. It's not much of a difference, but they would abort the newly born. In our times, they would abort the unborn. So it's a little bit less messy in our times, but basically amounting to the same thing. And So you have the elite promoting these practices. Of course, when there are these gatherings where people do gather at these holy shrines, they have to spend. They have to spend on incense. They have to spend on fabrics. They do their shopping. So basically, the marketplaces would be arranged around these holy sites. And so where people gathered for these holy sites, that would be where the malls would be. So people would shopping there, you know. And also the trade would be rendered safe for particular parts of the year when people would observe the sacred months. So trade would be secure for 4 months at least for the year. And that is how what I'm trying to illustrate to you is how the cultural practices and the cultural elite, those priests, etc., who were in charge of all these holy spots, who were in charge of the institutions like when the holy months would be, the calendar, etc., the sighting of the moon, those priestly class would be in partnership with a wealthy elite, who would control the resources, the flow of finances, the flow of trade across the desert and across countries. And so the wealthy elite and the cultural elite would be very, very closely aligned. On the ground, you had, as I said, the pagans who would just be basically acting out in terms of the demands or the way that the world is shaped for them by the elite. So that is pretty much how the prophet experienced his society. And so he comes and he questions a number of these assumed and adopted practices. In fact, he questions the idea of many gods and that every god has got its own demands, and he basically brings the idea of one god and the invalidating all these other gods or places or objects of worship and reverence. And that is really the society that he experiences. But his biggest enemy is basically ignorance. Jahiliya, as the Arabs, the word in Arabic is. And his biggest challenge is that people steeped in ignorance are unwilling to give him a hearing or to even consider what he is arguing or what he is trying to convey to them. And their ignorance is a huge barrier. And so they continue within their existence, within that life that they have chosen for themselves, without really giving him any serious consideration. And we now know that he never really succeeded. That for the first 10 to 13 years, which he spent in a city called Mecca, he never really convinced any sizable number of people. And 99% of the city really abandoned him eventually. And it came to the point where after 13 years that an assassination squad was deployed to get rid of him, finally. And it is only when he learned that there was an assassination being planned, where he was going to be eliminated, that he decided that, time up, and then he departed the city of Mecca. So this chapter is kind of a bit depressing, but also very inspiring, because the one point that is constantly made in this chapter, the 6th chapter, the one point that is constantly being made is that if God so willed, he could make them all believers. He could make them all mu'mineen. But that is not how God operates. So, in fact, he comforts the prophet at many places in this chapter, and he tells him that your job is really not to be a supervisor over them. Your job is not to persuade them. Your job is just to render the message to them. It's like to proclaim, to read the proclamation for them, to go there and be a mouthpiece for the Word of God. And once you've rendered that message, your job is done. Your job is done. To be a leader and to lead your own people who have already committed to the message, yes, that's a different story. But you have no answering or answerability or responsibility over those who reject. So those who are unwilling to accept the message, you have no further business with them. Once you've read and rendered the message to them, they are free to choose. And that is really the gist of what goes on in this chapter. So I've picked one or two verses, and I think these verses are very, very, very powerful and eloquent, and they really capture the spirit of this chapter. Now let's read through it together. أَوَمَنْ كَانَ مَيْتًا فَأَحْيَيْنَاهُ وَجَعَلْنَا لَهُ نُورًا يَمْشِي بِهِ فِي النَّاسِ. And let me start again. I didn't say the أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أَوَمَنْ كَانَ مَيْتًا فَأَحْيَيْنَاهُ وَجَعَلْنَا لَهُ نُورًا يَمْشِي بِهِ فِي النَّاسِ كَمَنْ مَثَلُهُ فِي الظُّلُمَاتِ لَيْسَ بِخَارِجٍ مِنْهَا كَذَلِكَ زُيِّنَ لِلْكَافِرِينَ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. And the beautiful meaning here, and I've got the meaning of many other translators here, but I don't think they capture this meaning. So let me render the meaning for you. Can a person who once was lifeless, who we then revived and granted illumination, who then deals with people with such illumination, can such a person be regarded the same as his equivalent, steeped in darkness from which he cannot escape? It is under such conditions of darkness that the evil actions of the obstructors are made to seem fair in their own eyes. Isn't that beautiful? Let's go to the next verse. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَا فِي كُلِّ قَرْيَةٍ أَكَابِرَ مُجْرِمِيهَا لِيَمْكُرُوا فِيهَا وَمَا يَمْكُرُونَ إِلَّا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ وَمَا يَشْعُرُونَ. Under such conditions of ignorance, in other words, do we allow the emergence of a corrupt elite in every metropolis, strategizing therein? Their strategies only affect themselves, but they fail to notice it. Now let's quickly capture the gist of these two verses. In the first verse, the idea of the truth bringing life is raised. And without truth, man and woman have no life. You have no life when you have no purpose. And so this first verse, 6:122, it associates the illumination brought by the light of truth as life-giving, as a life-giving illumination. So once we are illuminated with the message of the holy text and the holy book, and with any truth, we then deal with people with this illumination. Yamshi bihi finnas. The word literally in the text says Yamshi bihi finnas. You walk amongst people within this illuminated state. So you receive this illumination, وَيَمْشِي بِهِ فِي النَّاسِ, and you walk amongst people in this state of illumination. Now the question is, can such a person who walks around in this illuminated state be regarded the same as his equivalent, as his counterpart, who remains steeped, caught, trapped in darkness, the darkness of ignorance, the darkness of not knowing, the darkness of being devoid of truth, and he cannot escape from it. So this beautifully, beautifully lays out the role of knowledge and how knowledge ends slavery. Because in these words, clearly what comes out is that knowledge brings freedom from slavery. Then the following verse, it actually reinforces the idea that with ignorance comes slavery. What kind of slavery? Under such conditions do we allow the emergence of a corrupt elite in every metropolis. So every country, every city, every society, when it becomes steeped in ignorance, when it loses track of what is real and what is fantasy, in this situation where they lose track of reality and mix fantasy with reality, those are the conditions under which the corrupt elite ascends and becomes more and more powerful, and end up in fact ruling and controlling the masses. And that is what the Qur'an says, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَا فِي كُلِّ قَرْيَةٍ أَكَابِرَ مُجْرِمِيهَا لِيَمْكُرُوا فِيهَا. If you read Arabic, you will see that my translation is absolutely correct. We allow for the emergence of a corrupt elite. Now, I haven't said we create the corrupt elite, because I do not believe Allah creates the corrupt elite, but وَجَعَلْنَا is a very rich word. It means we can also allow, or we can also enable the emergence of a corrupt elite. Right, so that is really the important two verses that I wanted to show you, and then you can draw the parallels. If you think about society today, if you can compare what the Prophet is experiencing today, then you cannot deny that the cultural elite, those who are in control of our thinking, in other words, those who control the culture, the cultural offerings that we consume, Hollywood, anything that comes across on the mass media, on the mainstream entertainment and news media, these are all conditioning streams or conditioning tools. And what they do is they condition your mind, and they mix truth or a version of reality with fantasy. And in that mixture of reality and fantasy, if you approach it with an ignorant mind, with a mind that is devoid of any clear illumination, then you become an adopter of such fantasy, of such inventions, of such concoctions. Because that is the other point that the Qur'an makes very clearly. Maybe I should just get that verse. Take a look at this verse here, because it's important that we realize that there are an orchestrated attempt in the time of the Prophet to concoct a version of reality that is not related to reality itself. And this verse here, it speaks very eloquently. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. For every prophet we made appear an adversary, truly wicked individuals from the ranks of ordinary as well as extraordinary men. They inspire each other with flowery discourses in order to bamboozle. Had your Lord so willed it, they would be rendered unable to do this. Just ignore them and their concoctions. And so the parallel I want to draw is that in our time, we experience the same elite, the cultural elite, and the cultural elite that is in cahoots with the economic elite. Who is the economic elite? Those are the people that control global trade, who control the markets, who control resources on the planet. And of course, the Prophet faced a localized elite. We're facing today an elite that has taken on global proportions. But we ourselves are no longer single individuals as the Prophet was. You see, we now speak, when I speak to you, I speak across the continents. I speak across the oceans to you. And so we are able to mount a similar counteroffensive against these enslavers of humanity so that we can overcome them and free our people from the shackles which they impose on our people. So the Qur'an speaks loudly about them in the time of the Prophet, but we find abundant resonance with our era and with our epoch, in the epoch in which we exist. Now the question might be, what is the message of the Prophet and what is the message to us today? I think the first point that I must remind you of, which the Prophet, which is encapsulated in this chapter, is that have no fear for any other but God. Shake off the fear, the insecurity that you might feel for any other but the one God. In God, there is security. In God, there is protection. With these imposters, with these imposed authorities, self-imposed authorities, there is no security. There is only self-destruction eventually. And so even though you might have a very comfortable, secure job, yes, you are secure as long as you produce for them. The moment you lose your utility to them, you'll lose your security also. And your security will only be temporary as long as you choose, as long as you place your trust only in these elite forces and powers. So I think the first step that the Prophet is advising us in this chapter is that shift your trust, your allegiance, your true faith to God, the one God, Allah, Ar-Rahman. And it is a conceptual, it is a psychological, it is a mental shift that has to take place, an attitudinal shift that has to take place. That is step one, is to recognize that power, authority, our real fate does not lie with the elite, but it lies with God Almighty. And you know, let me bring in a sort of a personal angle on this also. You know, my last boss that I worked for, and I used to be an employee and I felt comfortable with getting a salary every month. The last boss I served was 20 years ago this year. On the 1st of June, it will be 20 years since I gave in my resignation letter to the government department where I was a deputy director and an acting director. I gave in my resignation 20 years ago in June, on June the 1st this year. And I can talk to you about having trust and faith in God for these 20 years. Because in these 20 years, I've had no boss except my one true God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Ar-Rahman. I knew always that in the real world, there is enough for me to survive on. But I always felt that I lack the confidence, the trust in God to make that shift. And now it's 20 years and I can talk to you about living off my own skills, my own hard work, my own efforts, and the unimportance with which I view people who employ others. I employ people now from time to time. I have people that work for me, and I I know how the employee views the employer. The employer is a very powerful person. And so that is the mental shift that you need to do. And even I'm not saying leave your job, but what I'm saying is you need to view your job in a much less with much less reverence. You need to regard God as your provider and your job as a mere instrument which God is using. That is the first thing that the Qur'an in this chapter seems to be showing, is that we need to make a attitudinal shift towards fearing and respecting and revering the one God, and not your employer, not your priest, not your Maulana, not your Sheikh. Because if your allegiance is to any but God, then you will succumb to superstition, to false beliefs, to fantasy. And that is the biggest problem. That will lead you right back to slavery. I guess the second step that this chapter is saying is that there needs to be a transformation of your behavior. So once you have made that attitudinal shift towards God, towards the one God, towards allegiance only to God, and counting everything else as of secondary importance, including your career, your job, your boss, whatever, then there comes a shift in behavior. And that shift in behavior comes out in this verse here, where it says, you walk amongst people with that illumination. So you become a person of trust, a person of honesty, a person that can be relied upon, a person that speaks and stands for justice and for fairness, a person that speaks and stands for cleanliness, for morality, for social and personal cleanliness, because in the Quran the word zakah refers to social cleanliness. And what is social cleanliness? It is not to mess up socially. As you don't mess up personally, you don't poop yourself, pee yourself and walk around like that. So you do not have sex randomly and then leave your offspring, the children that are born out of those illicit relationships, to fend for themselves and to become lost people in this society, lost to poverty and to degradation and to social. So once we change our attitude to God, we then adopt His code, which is a code of social and personal cleanliness, which is a code of fairness, righteousness, and justice, which is a code of honesty and integrity. And that is the second level of commitment that we then undertake. And so we are not even speaking about political transformation, because that is beyond the social, the personal and individual transformation. Comes the political transformation, comes the social challenges that we need to engage in, where we need to confront those who are imposing these oppressive practices within our society. So I think in brief, I've given you an idea of what Surah or chapter 6 is reflecting, and the battle that the Prophet faced within his city of Mecca. Unfortunately, he was never successful in that city. And we may not be successful also. But I think the standard of a good mu'min is not whether he won or lost, but whether he engaged in the mission. And so I challenge you all, let us all engage in the mission. Victory belongs to God. Our job is to render the message, to tell the truth as we see it, and to move on. Whether people want to hear it or not, that's their business. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.